Okay, we have the story of Jiraiya as told by Darius the Green Angel. So a long time ago in the land of Naruto, in the Hidden Leaf Village, Jiraiya was born. He became a student of Hiruzen. Out of all three students, he was the one who was behind. It seemed like he needed special needs, but he just needed to lock in, better. He was much like, young Naruto was. He was younger. And he, ended up learning the summoning jutsu from Hiruzen. He was like, you can make a contract with an animal and do that. He ended up summoning a frog. While Tsunade and Orochimaru were doing shit with Hiruzen, he let his sensei know that, hey, I ought to go to the land of Mount Miyaboku, the land of the frog people, or just the frogs, and learn how to become a sage. And he was like, oh, you're going to try to do that? And he's like, yeah, because I can. And he's like, all right, yeah. And then he went and he trained with the old man frog, the grandpa frog, as Naruto calls him, and they end up working together for a little bit. And then when they were working together, he, learned how to balance on a um, tile piece that's like, big enough for his ass to sit on, or a piece of wood, and like on a little, you know, needle, and he's basically learning balance and then how to take in nature energy. That's the main thing he was learning. His, physical, mental energy that's already there, and then taking the nature energy, mixing it together to become, a sage. Now, Jiraiya learned how to do this, and he, became stronger physically, able to sense things around him better, because Sage Mode allows you to do shit like that. He wasn't a perfect Sage, though, as he was taking on features of a rock. But he was pretty damn good at using the frog jutsus, too. Summoning the frogs and then having them fight alongside him. He got a prophecy from the, oldest frog in Mount Miyamoku, who was there since, the times of, Hagoromo, the sixth path. And he told Dry, he said, you will, basically be the teacher for the one who will change this world. The child of prophecy. You're going to be the one who has a hand in his development. So it's like, on you to basically save the world. And he knew this. He, with this knowledge, he, traveled around the world for a little bit, trying to figure some things out. He come across different ninjas who were talking about, changing the world a little bit, or fighting for, a type of justice in a way that, grabbed his eye a little bit. But these, shinobi ended up, not quite having what, aura he's trying to look for, like presence, or, that type of person that they're supposed to be. And so he continued his journey until he had, been called to war, because it was their Great Ninja War, I believe. That's when Hanzo was running around in the Rain Village. They had an encounter with Hanzo, they being Jiraiya, Orochimaru, and Tsunade. During this encounter, that's when they obtained the title of Sannin. When they obtained the title of Sannin, It was because they fought against Hanzo the Salamander, who used poison, and he was summoning a creature too. Jiraiya, got injured. Orochimaru tried to be like, let's leave him for dead. Tsunade, because he's like weak. He ended up surviving, and he survived to see these three children, war orphans of the Rain Village. As the Hidden Rain Village, as we know, and I always remind you guys who are Naruto fans, that it sits between the five great nations, and it's not a part of them. So their land is used as a battlefield every time there's a war. And these kids are, orphaned because of, the violence and, bloodshed and all that shit that comes with war, right? And Jiraiya feels bad for him, and he's like, I need to leave them with something, at least. Do what I can for them. Me being a ninja that knows, different jutsus and things, and I have time on my hands, I can do that for them. Orochimaru was like, let's just kill them, get them out of the way, and, Tsunade's like, let's not fuck with that. And he's like, no, I have to do this for these kids, and he stayed in the Rain Village. He ended up teaching Yahiko, Nagato, and Konan how to, use jutsu. Not there to use it for good and protect themselves with it. He, saw that Conan had, an origami type of jutsu, and, it was unique. Yahiko, I believe he used water jutsu. And then Nagato awakened his Rinnegan. Or it didn't awaken it, always had it, but he used it against somebody who was fucking with Yahiko. And then Drive pulled him aside and was like, you might be that warrior, that person that's supposed to, change this world. But you have to, within yourself, know how to use your power for, good. That's why I came here, part of the reason why I came for all of you three. But I see it in you because you have, special eyes. You have a power that other people don't have. So use it wisely and, use it for good, that type of thing. And he left him with that. And then he went about, living his life as a ninja. The war came to an end, and he, he just traveled around, doing things and, honing his skills as a sage, the best he could. And eventually he met Naruto, and he did come up for consideration for Hokage, but Minato ended up becoming Hokage, and then he died, and then Hiruzen took the seat back because Dry was out doing things, exploring the world, figuring out basically threats that could come to the Hidden Leaf Village, because he's smart and he ain't dumb, so he's out somewhere else in the world, right? But he's there, and he's known too as one of the legendary Sannin, on par with the third Hokage, Hiruzen. So then he finds Naruto, and he's, looking around where he shouldn't be or should be, however he feels about that situation. But basically, he was supposed to train with Ibuzu Sensei, which is Konohamaru Sensei, and then he finds Naruto, and he's like, damn, do you know who I am? And he's like, no, I don't care, you're a pervy sage. And he's like, oh, you don't know who you're talking to, and he's, giving him some information, because this is him, Naruto, going into the tuning exams. And, Naruto, kind of got slighted by, Kakashi a little bit, because he wasn't getting special training, to go into this, tuning exams. He was to train with Ibuzu Sensei, so Sasuke and Kakashi could learn the Chidori. He didn't learn that from Jiraiya yet. He learned summoning jutsu, and what Jiraiya did for him was Jiraiya unsealed the chakra that was lying within Naruto, because the Nine-Tails chakra is what I'm talking about. Orochimaru had sealed it because he didn't want to deal with that shit in the forest of death during the earlier parts of the tuning exams. And then Jiraiya was like, okay, I'll open it back up for you, and then you can call upon your red chakra When you feel like your blue chakra is being depleted or you need, extra chakra, in your battle. And it did happen during the fight with Neji. It came in handy. So thanks to Jiraiya, Naruto was able to, handle Neji and shit. If you think about it, you probably would have lost that fight. Because Jiraiya was the one who unsealed the seal a little bit so that he could have access to a little bit of the Nine Tails chakra. And then he taught him the also summoning Gambunta, and he used that against Gaara to defeat him. Without that move, he wouldn't have beat Gaara. So Jiraiya was there for him. After the Konoha crush and him fighting, and Jiraiya was there to help the Leaf out during that time. The Leaf was without a Hokage. And they were like, maybe Jiraiya. And he's like, no, but I know somebody who can. We'll find Tsunade. But before that, Katsuki showed up. And he tried to take Naruto. That being Itachi and Kisame were trying to take Naruto. They weren't going to fight against Jiraiya. They didn't know exactly how powerful he was, and they just didn't want to fight. They were trying to just get what they needed and get the fuck out of there. Sasuke wasn't even supposed to be there. They were just like, we'll cut our losses and come at him at a different date. And they were, trying to play it smart because Naruto's a boy and they can get him right there. But guess what? Jiraiya was there and they didn't want to have to fight and then become injured or end up, dying because they wanted to fight against Jiraiya. Jiraiya even sealed away some of the Amaterasu flames. These flames that can't be extinguished unless the caster says so. The black flames of Amaterasu. The fire that burns fire itself, right? And he was able to put that in a little scroll and keep that shit for later, right? He then, moved on to training Naruto as he was, going to get Tsunade as well. I'll teach you the Rasengan since you're with me and, you might as well learn something. And then he was like, the fourth Hokage's jutsu, it's his jutsu. He actually taught it to me, and now I'm going to teach it to you because you look very much like, and we understand that that's, Naruto and Minato were actually, father and son. And Jiraiya ended up training Naruto. He and him, and then found Tsunade. He was like, you gotta go to the Leaf and become the Hokage. The first Hokage is your grandfather. You have, like, the will of fire within you. You have it more than me or Orochimaru, girl. You gotta get over there and do your fucking job. And then she was like, no, I left that shit behind and shit like that. And he's like, no. And you see that boy right there with the yellow hair and shit, with the fucking, my student, he wants to be Hokage one day. You're telling you, like, what? Come on now. And she, showed a little something. But at the same time, Orochimaru came through and was like, I'll bring your brother back to life. Jiraiya said, no, that ain't how that jutsu works. He said, girl, you're gonna, like, be cracked out and other things fucking with Orochimaru. He's gonna, like, parade your family around and, fuck you up. You don't do shit like that. So now that you gotta become the Hokage and basically move forward with, like, what they wanted. So now they wanted to become, the Hokage. Your little brother, and then damn, they both are done wanted to become Hokage. And you can basically, live their dream for them. Moving forward. Instead of living in the past and going to Orochimaru to bring them back to life when they get brought back to life. Getting gonna be like that. But she was still considering it. She ended up poisoning Dry, so she could meet with Orochimaru and, see what he had going on. But then she was like, you know what? What I did to Dry was not good. And Dry was like, yeah, it wasn't. Because guess what? He was down to 30% of his chakra when fighting against Orochimaru. But he was still doing pretty well. He was able to, hurt Orochimaru too, who also had, like, a handicap. She was the only one who didn't have any, restrictions on her abilities. It was her mental state. She hadn't fought in a while, and she was like, oh my god, the blood and other things. She was fighting against Kabuto, and, Jiraiya was fighting against Orochimaru after they all three summoned their, the three-way deadlock. Katsuyu, Gamabunta, and Manda, right? All three of them were there. And Manda was fighting against Gamabunta with Jiraiya and Orochimaru. Orochimaru was fighting against Jiraiya. And then they got away, because he had plans to get Sasuke later and shit. Orochimaru, that is. And then Jiraiya was like, after Naruto's failed attempts of going after Sasuke, he said, Naruto, I understand what you're trying to do is save your friend, but that's not good, Naruto. You can't save him. He's going down a path just like, he's not no different than Orochimaru. There's no saving him. And you're a fool if you, continue to go down that path. And Naruto just like, then I'll remain a fool for this. And Jiraiya's like, damn, there's no stopping that shit with you, is there? Well, at the very least, you need to come train. You need to come train with me. You need to come train with me. Because you need to, become stronger, and it'll do you well, And he was like, I'll go train and get stronger so I can, because for Naruto was to save Sasuke. He just knew that, or he knew that Naruto really wanted to become Hokage, and in order to do that, he has to actually, put in the work and be a strong and gutsy, ninja. He learned how to, do the Rasengan better, control his chakra better to some degree. He got himself a new suit because he had like destroyed the other one. Their training was that difficult for Naruto, but came back to the village and Jiraiya was still breathing and other things. He was good and other stuff, but he told Kakashi something. During their training, Naruto had, gone into Three Tails form, and he still had some, control. But by the time Four Tails showed, he actually lost control, and the Nine Tails was basically running around, just not fully manifested. And he's like, he showed him the scar that the Nine Tails gave him, Naruto in Four Tail state, and he's like, you have to put this tag on Naruto before he goes into the Four Tail state, because if he does that, then there's no stopping him. And he gave the tag to Kakashi, and then they went, and Naruto, Kakashi, and Sakura went with Temari back to the Sand Village. They tried to go save Gaara from the Akatsuki. He was, he remained in the Hidden Leaf Village. When they got back, he was like, okay. He, started to do, reconnaissance missions on the Akatsuki. The Akatsuki's after Naruto now. They're making their move. They went after Gaara. They were successful with that. Now they're gonna go after Naruto and these other tail beasts. I'll figure out what the fuck's going on. And this basically all led to, and then remember what I said about Dry teaching those three kids a long time ago, because it comes into play here with, like, basically, where we're going with this. He goes back to the Rain Village after years of not being there, and he told, Tsunade, I'm going to look into, that, because I hear that the leader of, I have reason to believe that the leader of the Akatsuki is, like, based out of the Hidden Rain Village, and I've been there before, we've been there before, but I want to see what the fuck's going on, and he went there. you know, by himself to do this. And he did that. He was looking into things, and they were like, Lady Angel, protects us. Lord Payne protects us. And they're like, who is this? He's like, who's this? Because I knew about Hanzo the Salamander. And they're like, oh, we don't talk about him no more. We don't talk about that guy. And then they're like, okay. Or he's like, all right. Well, Hanzo was the person who was, here when I was here last. So some shit's changed a bit. Eventually he found some guys and they started talking a little bit. Lord Payne and, them, are transferred, had to get some bodies real quick so they could, do what they had to do. Basically, Dry runs up on Conan and finds, Nagato as well. But it's not Nagato. He's confused because he finds all these pains and he fights against them in full sage mode. Yeah, this is the time when we find out that Dry has sage mode. But when he's using it, he had to summon the old frog, both of them, the like grandpa and grandma frog, and they were on his shoulders and they were fighting against these pains. He defeated what, three of them or two of them? Like he defeated a couple of them. One really. Um, but he was figuring out the like Renegon and how it worked. You know, he saw the body of Yahiko being controlled by Nagato, but to him he was like, "Are you Yahiko or Nagato? Did you steal Nagato's eyes? What's going on?" And he was figuring things out as the fight was going on, but unfortunately for Dry, he was getting jumped by six Renegon bears who could each of them had a different ability. Like he knew nothing of the Renegon beforehand. He knew that one of his students had it and that was it. He didn't know the ins and outs and everything else. You know, he was killed there. That's where his journey ends. No bringing him back to reanimation either. That's kind of the sad thing about Jiraiya's backstory, or like his death and shit. Some fans are like, why didn't he come back to life? He needed to stay dead though, and like that sounds harsh and shit because other things, but it basically made Naruto, that's when Naruto like became like more powerful than like people like realize and shit. That's when he actually became like a hero and was actually moving towards his goals. Was when Jiraiya died. Bringing him back for any type of things would like I don't know. Not with him. It wasn't like not necessary. To me, he he died, a hero too, because he did get the information to, Tsunade in code because he didn't want, people to grab the frog and then, take information, numbers and, certain, like kanji letters that Naruto would pick up on and other people would pick up on in the, like, cipher core, like deciphering his code. But, Dry was a great ninja, apparently he completed like the most missions out of any shinobi in, Konoha, like out of even like his own students and shit like that, you know. He had the potential to be Okage, but, you know, he settled for being a teacher and, a sage that knew, who he was, I guess. And he did, he had books that he wrote about too, he knew about people and, he was like not like Orochimaru. Like he wouldn't just fuck with people, you know what I'm saying? Like he would sit down and have conversations with them, learn a thing or two, maybe impart some, wisdom onto somebody else. If he ain't fighting, he would fight people too who are fucking with other people. This man was not a, character. Like I'm not saying that, he deserved to die or anything like that, but the man, didn't need to be brought back into the story because that ultimately made Naruto a more powerful person. Now that my sensei's gone, I'm hurt, but now I'm gonna work harder to like, surpass him. You know, I'm gonna defeat the guy who killed my master. who just so happened to also be, another student of his. And we found that out later too when he fought against, or Naruto found that out against Pain. But you know, great character, pretty, powerful, versatile person. He knew of like, you know, all natures of chakra, I believe. He used water jutsu with the frogs, flame jutsu, um, wind jutsu. I don't recall him using like any lightning jutsu though. But he, was damn good at using, those jutsus. And then he was a sage too, which is like there's only a couple sages. Not a perfect sage, but he knew how to use it. Um, and yeah, that's Jiraiya in his story. That's told by Darius the Green Angel. Be cool on the corner and watch Naruto again if you want to. And if you like me and like don't, or maybe not like me, but like if you're a anime head who hasn't seen Naruto in a while, watch it again and then let me know what you think about Jiraiya too in the comments.